My name is Robert Dijkgraaf, Director and Leon Levy Professor here at the Institute of Advanced Study, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to an event which is in many ways festive. First of all of you might have noticed that today the rain stopped, the sun came out, and it was gorgeous fall weather, which usually means we have a Board of Trustee meeting. And the second reason is that it gives me extremely great pleasure to introduce our lecturer today, Sabine Schmidtke, for her first official lecture as faculty member, but I'm sure it will be the first of a long series of engagements here with the Institute. Sabine is a leading scholar of Islamic intellectual history who joined the Institute in July as professor in the School of Historical Studies. And in that sense, the school is continuing what I think is a wonderful and very meaningful continued connection to the field of Islamic studies with such great scholars as Oleg Grabar and Patricia Krohn. And for you, Sabine, the Institute was not a new institution. You have been here as a member on two occasions, 2008, 2009, and last year, which I must say helped very much when we're trying to entice you to come, that we're not projecting theoretical images, but you were actually right here to see the physical incarnation of the Institute. And clearly, it's just wonderful to welcome you here. So warm welcome, let me start with that. Now, Sabine has played a central role in the exploration of hereforth unedited and unknown theological and philosophical writings. And you are one of the internationally leading philologists. And in fact, you are in some sense almost a production house if you just the amount of text and that you have been analyzing with you and your group is very impressive. All of that has been, of course, reflected in many articles and books. The latest include a book for which he was an editor, Speaking for Islam, Religious Authorities in Muslim Societies, which highlights the scope and variety of religious authorities in present and past Muslim societies. Sabine received her DPhil in 1990 from the University of Oxford, and then from 1991 to 1999 she was a diplomat in the German Foreign Office, so you actually also a fine tradition with Institute faculty like George Kennan and Jack Matlock. We finally have a diplomat as a faculty member here. Then you were a lecturer in Islamic studies at the Rheinische Friedrich Wilhelms Universität in Bonn from 79 to 99, where you also received your habilitation. As you were a visiting professor of Islamic Studies at the Freie Universität Berlin from 1999 to 2001, after which you became full professor and served there until this summer, 2014. Sabine is extremely active in this field in many different capacities. I just mentioned that you're editor-in-chief of Intellectual History of the Islamic World and the Biblia Arabica, Text and Studies, and you are on the editorial and advisory boards of many leading publications and organizations in the field. Currently, Sabine is working on the history of Islamic thought in the post-classical period, which is the 13th to the 19th centuries, with a focus on reconstructing the textual heritage and an intellectual import of the Islamic intellectual world for Iran to Central Asia to Turkey and Spain. And it's something that's perhaps your defining characteristic, the way you are working across regions, across time, and across various kind of religious traditions. I mean, I think we see some of that in today's lectures, which is titled, as you see, Muslim Perceptions and Receptions of the Bible. And you will explore the much debated issue of when and through which channels Muslim scholars became familiar with the Bible, as well as the emergence of the so-called Muslim Bible scholarship from the 13th century onward. So please join me not only in welcome Sabine to the stage, but welcome her to the Institute.
Thank you, Robert, for this generous introduction. And it's a great pleasure and an honor for me to be able to speak to you today and to have been invited to join the faculty of the Institute. And I'm very grateful to the Board of Trustees that sustains the mission of this unique institution. Islamic tradition reflects an acute awareness of its connection to Judaism and Christianity, the monotheistic religions that preceded it. The Quran situates itself as the final revelation within a progressive series of divine dispensations and shows an intimate familiarity with the earlier scriptures and with a much longer list of earlier prophets, with heavily recast adaptations of the Pentateuchal and prophetic narratives. Accordingly, the Quran depicts itself as the last perfect link in a chain of progressive divine dispensations, which culminates with Muhammad as the seal of the prophets. This stance sets the stage for the ambivalent attitude seen in the Quran and in the Muslim tradition towards the two earlier monotheistic religions and their scriptures, an attitude that resembles in many respects that of the New Testament and the evolving Christian tradition towards Judaism and the Hebrew Bible. The authenticity of the earlier scriptures as divine dispensation is accepted, as the Quran acknowledges a large degree of correspondence between itself and the earlier revelations. It is said to continue and to confirm, to renew and to clarify the earlier dispensations. Closely related to this is the Quranic claim that the earlier scriptures contain annunciations of Muhammad. In Surah 61, for example, the following statement is attributed to Jesus. And when Jesus, son of Mary, said, O children of Israel, lo, I am the messenger of God unto you, confirming that which was revealed before me in the Torah, and bringing good tidings of a messenger who cometh after me, whose name is Praised One, Ahmad. The triconsonantal root, ha mim dal of Ahmad, literally, the most deserving of praise, is identical with that of the name of Muhammad. Unsurprisingly, the Quran's self-image as a scriptural continuation of the earlier revelations carries a reverse negative side, namely that the Quran, God's most recent and final dispensation, supersedes all earlier writings, which have as a result largely lost their validity. Indeed, the Quran repeatedly emphasizes its superiority over the previous revelations that have been abrogated by it. A further recurrent motif is the accusation that the people of the book, that is, Jews and Christians, have tampered with, altered, or partly forgotten their own writings, so that the existing versions of the Bible no longer correspond to the original dispensations. This topos is alluded to in the Quran and eventually emerged alongside the already mentioned notions of abrogation and the Bible's foretelling of the advent of Muhammad as one of the central themes of Muslim polemic against Jews and Christians. We can observe a variety of ways in which Muslim authors over the centuries perceived and used the Bible. As with the Quranic attitudes towards the earlier scripture, these are equally ambiguous and often contradictory. At the same time, modern scholarship dealing with the Muslim reception of the Bible is faced with challenges that vary according to period, literary genre, and milieu. I shall address some of these challenges in what follows. The attitude of the early Islamic community towards the scriptural heritage of the people of the book is predominantly a positive one. Biblical and pseudo-biblical motifs and materials exerted an enormous influence on Islamic literature during the first centuries of Islam. The positive, albeit ambivalent, attitude of the Quran is also reflected in the Sunnah, that is, the extensive corpus of reports believed to document the sayings and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad, a corpus that in many ways reflects the state of mind of the early Islamic community. Here we find occasional reports attesting to the Prophet's critical view of contacts between Muslims and Jews, unambiguously advising his followers not to consult with Jews or their writings or on any biblical prophets or episodes. Even so, these are outnumbered by traditions according to which the Prophet explicitly approved of Christian and Jewish traditional knowledge and permitted the reading of the earlier scriptures side by side with the Quran. Statements such as these legitimize the incorporation of a large amount of extra-canonical Jewish and Christian lore into the Muslim tradition, often in heavily Islamicized form. This corpus, which later on was dubbed Israeliyat, played an important role in the literary genre of prophetic narratives and in the early exegetical literature and historiography, as well as in all the other literary genres that had prophetic traditions as their principal constituents. During the same period, works titled Proofs or Signs of Prophecy evolved as another popular genre aimed at establishing the authenticity of Muhammad's prophetic mission. Again, pseudo-biblical Islamicized lore forms one of the core components of such books. The trajectories through which these materials were transmitted were for the most part Jewish converts to Islam or their immediate dependents, such as Ka'b al-Ahbar, Abdullah bin Salam, and Wahab al-Munabbi, to name just the most renowned figures, as well as storytellers. The sheer quantity of these materials proves beyond doubt that the acceptance of Jewish and Christian lore was widespread during the first 2 centuries of Islam and did not encounter any serious opposition. As is the case with the biblical reminiscences in the Quran, the identification of the relevant sources that are reflected in this rich corpus, be they of Jewish or Syro-Christian provenance, has been a favorite topic for Western scholars since the late 19th century and continues to be an important field of inquiry for contemporary scholarship. Compared with the abundant extra-biblical material in Islamicized form, the number of authentic biblical quotations included in the early Islamic literature is limited. Curiously enough, despite the ubiquity of allusions to biblical narratives and motifs throughout the Quran, the text contains only a single, nearly verbatim biblical quotation, namely Quran 21:105, which includes a passage taken from Psalm 37. By the 8th century, quotations of authentic biblical passages appear in the works of a number of Muslim authors. Muḥammad bin Ishaq, the author of the famous biography of the Prophet Muhammad, is reported to have cited passages from the Pentateuch and the Gospel. Authentic biblical quotations are also included in some of the historiographies of the 9th and 10th centuries. Abdullah bin Muslim ibn Qutayba adduced in some of his works, particularly his Book of Knowledge, in which he deals with the history of the pre-Islamic prophets, large portions of the Pentateuch. Other historical works, such as Ahmad al-Yaqubi's history, also contain comprehensive sections that are culled from the 4 Gospels. Similar observations can be made for Hamza al-Isfahani's history of the years of the kings of the earth and of the prophets. We also encounter during the early centuries instances in which Muslim scholars drew on the Bible to support their own theological argumentation, as a rule, in addition to the Quran and the Sunnah. The Shi'i Zaydi Imam Al-Qasim bin Ibrahim al-Rassi, for example, who was closely familiar with Christian theological notions, proudly confesses his intimate knowledge of the Bible, and he occasionally adduces relevant biblical passages, quoting by heart as it seems, alongside relevant passages from the Quran. When discussing God's oneness and his attributes, for example, he quotes Exodus 3:6, in addition to pertinent Quranic passages. In his treatment of the concept that some Quranic verses were abrogated by other verses of the Quran, Al-Qasim quotes verses from the Gospel of Matthew that testify to the New Testament's claim of abrogating Mosaic law. The mid-11th century 12th Shi'i theologian and jurist Muḥammad bin Ali al-Karajiki also uses the Bible as proof to further underpin his theological views. To prove the veracity of the specific 12th Shi'i notion of the imamat, he quotes Genesis 17:20. The passage served him, and as a matter of fact other 12th Shi'i scholars, as evidence that the number of imams was indeed 12, a concept central to the beliefs of this branch of Shi'ism, whose followers accordingly also call themselves Twelvers, and that this has already been foretold in the Bible. Ismaili Shi'i authors are likewise known for their practice of quoting from the Bible as evidence for their particular notions of prophecy and imamat, as is the case with Abul Hatim al-Razi in his Science of Prophecy and Hamid ad-Din al-Kirmani. Al-Kirmani, in at least 3 of his works, cites passages from the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, adducing the original Hebrew or Aramaic for quotations from the Hebrew Bible, and the Syriac for the passages gleaned from the New Testament in Arabic transcription, along with their translations into Arabic. Another literary genre in which authentic biblical materials play a prominent role is interreligious apologetics and polemics. The earliest extant Muslim refutations of Christianity date to the 8th century. These include an epistle addressed to the Byzantine Emperor Leo III, attributed to the Caliph Omar bin Abdulaziz, and a treatise addressed to Constantine VI, written on behalf of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid by Abu al-Rabi' ibn al-Layth. Apart from theological arguments, these epistles contain quotations from Deuteronomy, the Psalter, Habakkuk, and Isaiah that are interpreted as predictions of the Prophet Muhammad. The earliest extant work, containing numerous proof texts from almost all books of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, is the Book of Religion and Empire, composed by the formerly Christian convert to Islam, Ali ibn Rabban al-Tabari, followed by the Book of the Signs of Prophecy by his near contemporary, the aforementioned Ibn Qutayba. Ibn Rabban's work had circulated, as it seems, mostly within Christian circles up until the 11th century, when it first came to the attention of Muslim readers. By contrast, Ibn Qutayba's work, although extant in only a single manuscript, resurfaced just a few years ago, and it was widely read among early Muslims and served many later authors up until the 18th century, directly or in most cases indirectly, as a source for relevant biblical passages. In what form did early Muslim scholars such as Ibn al-Layth, Ibn Rabban, Ibn Qutayba, and Yaqubi have access to the Bible? Where did the numerous biblical quotations they adduced come from? Were they verbally communicated to them by Christian or Jewish informants, or were these early scholars able to access them in written form of some sort? Did it make a difference for their approach to the Bible that Ibn al-Layth and Ibn Qutayba were born Muslims, whereas Ibn Rabban had converted to Islam and thus, as a former Christian who was well versed in Greek and Syriac, would have had immediate access to the Bible? The question as to how Muslim scholars of the early centuries of Islam had access to the Bible has barely been explored in any satisfactory manner in modern scholarship. Our understanding of the relevant trajectories and modes of transitions of the biblical texts among Muslim scholars and the ways they worked with the materials that were available to them remains cursory and deficient. The following 3 scenarios are theoretically plausible. The 10th century bibliographer Ibn Nadim, in his bibliography, an index of all books written in Arabic, whether by Arabs or others, up until the year 938, reports on various translations of the Bible, or parts of it, produced by Muslim scholars during the early days of Islam. Other Muslim sources attribute to some of the prominent early Muslims philological knowledge of Hebrew or Syriac and mention their intensive study of the Bible. Whereas references such as these testify to the early Muslims' appreciation of the Bible, we should be extremely cautious in taking these reports at face value. There is no independent evidence that would corroborate Ibn Nadim's report on any of these translation projects, for example, in the form of quotations. This absence of corroboration raises serious doubts as to the historicity of early Bible translations by Muslim scholars and their immediate familiarity with Hebrew or Syriac versions of the Bible or parts of it. Arabic Bible translations that were produced by non-Muslims constitute a more plausible source for authors such as Ibn al-Layth, Ibn Rabban, Ibn Qutayba, and al-Yaqubi. Unlike the phantom-like translation enterprises purportedly undertaken by early Muslims, there is ample material testifying to translations by members of other religious communities in their manifold denominations. In fact, we are faced here with the reverse situation. In view of the sheer mass of available material, most of which is still in manuscript form, scholarly exploration of the various translation traditions is in many ways still in its infancy. With the spread of Islam, Arabic became the new common language and the hallmark of the cultured elites that came under Islamic rule. This was true not only among the growing body of converts to Islam, but also among the Jews and the Christians whose scriptural heritage guaranteed their religious autonomy throughout the Islamic domain. From the 8th century onwards, socially immobile Christians and Jews began to use Arabic not only for oral communication, but also as their written language for religious, literary, and scientific purposes. The oldest Arabic Bible versions have come down to us from this early stage in the process of Arabicization of these groups, for whom scriptural translation was the initial vehicle in adapting their communal identity to a new world at a time of profound political and cultural change. Nota bene, the question as to whether there had been Jewish and Christian Arabic versions of the Bible in pre-Islamic Arabia, and whether they circulated in strictly oral form or were jotted down as aide-mémoire or constituted fuller textualized versions, is debated among scholars. As has been shown by Sidney Griffith, who has done several important studies on this topic, the Melkite Christian communities of South Palestine, the Sinai Peninsula, and Syria appear to have led the way in translating their scriptures from Greek and Syriac into Arabic. The fact that they adopted Arabic as their ecclesiastical language at a relatively early stage is intrinsically connected, as it seems, with a virtual isolation from Byzantium as a result of the Muslim conquests. Hence, the seemingly earliest extant translation known so far is a bilingual Greek-Arabic fragment of Psalm 78, which is commonly dated by scholars to the 8th century. The earliest dated translation, from 859, containing a partial translation of the Greek Gospels, is found in yet another manuscript of Melkite Christian provenance and was probably copied in one of the monastic communities in South Palestine. While the earliest Arabic translations based on Greek or Syriac text were thus most likely produced within the Melkite communities, followed by the East Syriac Church, that is the Church of the East, the largest single Christian community in Iraq, the process of Arabicization was considerably slower in the West Syriac communities, that is the Syriac Orthodox Church in the area of Tikrit in northern Iraq, and especially the Coptic communities in Egypt. For a longer period, these groups insisted on keeping their canonical scriptures in the sanctified languages, whether Greek, Syriac, or Coptic. Eventually, they tended to integrate various earlier Arabic translation traditions into their Arabic Bibles, produced in the 9th and 10th centuries. The Spanish Mozarabs, mostly Roman Catholics, are also known to have rendered the scriptures into Arabic at that time, often consulting Latin versions of the Bible, as is the case, for example, with the Arabic translation of the Gospels by Isaac ben Velázquez, dated 946, which was based on the Old Latin version. At the same time, the Mozarabs also implied partial translations into Arabic of Eastern provenance. Although Christian translations can be found for virtually all books of the Bible, the different communities produced translations primarily of those parts of the Bible that were central to their liturgy. Despite the high number and variety of Christian Arabic versions of the Bible or parts of it, no translation was ever canonized, and Arabic never reached the status of a church language. The scholarly exploration of the Christian Arabic translations of the Bible, which began in the late 19th century, is still far from being completed. In fact, scholars are agreed that considering the vast amount of mostly still unexploited Christian manuscript materials scattered in countless public, private, and monastery libraries around the world, what has been done so far is still very much only the beginning of a comprehensive study of the Christian materials. The Jews began producing written Arabic translations of their Bible about a century later than the Christians, sometime in the mid of the 9th century. In doing so, the Jews were responding, similar to the Christians, to the same social linguistic development that created a growing need for translating scripture. The Jews, too, appear to have moved from oral translation settings of their scripture to sporadic word lists and then to full-fledged translations, of which Saadia Gaon's version of the Pentateuch appears to have reached semi-canonical status in the second half of the 10th century. His translation was also available to the European community of scholars as is indicated by the fact that it was included in the Paris Polyglot Bible and in the London Polyglot, both of them printed in the 17th century. All the books of the Hebrew Bible are represented in the Jewish translation corpus, although, as might be expected, the Pentateuch and other books that served in synagogue worship, such as the Psalms, command the highest proportion of translations. The manuscripts that were discovered at the end of the 19th century in the Ben Ezra Geniza in Old Cairo, which are nowadays stored primarily in the University Library at Cambridge, comprise several thousand fragments of Arabic translations of the Bible, the majority of which are written in Hebrew character. Numerous other Judeo-Arabic versions of the Bible, Rabbinite as well as Karaite, can also be found in other libraries around the world. Again, only a fraction of these textual witnesses has been investigated up until now. On the basis of the extra material, it can be assumed likely that already during the 8th and 9th centuries, there existed a variety of oral translation traditions of the Bible into Arabic among the various non-Muslim communities that form part of the rich ethnic and religious tapestry of the medieval Arabic-speaking world. These traditions differed from one another in many ways. Apart from fully preserved books of the Bible, a rather late phenomenon in fact, thousands of manuscript fragments and codices containing portions of these translations and commentaries have come down to us. They reveal a large variety of stylistic approaches, vocabulary, scripts, and ideologies, ranging from literal versions bound to the Hebrew/Aramaic, Greek, or Syriac source text to doctrinally inspired non-literal versions oriented towards the cultural values of the fully Arabicized audience. Extracts of the various versions are also tested in the many other literary and more specifically liturgical genres, such as lectionaries and apologetics that circulated within the different communities. Moreover, the different versions were fairly mobile, coalescing within and beyond denominational, ecclesiastical, and geographical borders. Saadia's translations, for example, which were originally produced for a Jewish audience, are attested in manuscripts of Samaritan and Christian provenance, in addition to Syriac and Coptic adaptations of his translation of the Torah. The earliest dated Christian copy of his tafsir was copied in 1240 by a West Syrian scribe. Some of the East Syriac versions of the Pentateuch were later in common use among the Arabophone Christians of Spain, the Mozarabs, and the Karaite version of the Pentateuch by Yeshua ben Yehuda, a scholar who was active in 11th century Jerusalem, is attested in Samaritan manuscripts, which it is transcribed into Samaritan script. Moreover, secondary revision and adaptation of the respective versions is another common phenomenon that needs to be taken into consideration. Recent studies of clearly defined corpora of Bible translations, such as those by Hekmat Kashur on the Christian translations of Gospels, published in 2011, and Ronnie Folland on the Christian translations of the Pentateuch, currently in press, have shown that, I quote, any manuscript of a collection of biblical books in Arabic is likely to be an amalgam, of which each section has a long, separate textual history, end of quote. The sheer quantity of the material that is dispersed over countless libraries around the globe, the different translation traditions and versions, many of which underwent dramatic modifications as they traveled through time and space, and the numerous translation amalgams render this field of research terra incognita when new ground is to be broken, not only in terms of the data to be processed, but also in terms of interreligious and intercultural implications. What is known about the history of Bible translations among the various non-Muslim communities has immediate implications on for the study of the Muslim reception of the Bible, a field of inquiry that is in many respects likewise still in its infancy. This again demonstrates how important it is to study the materials originating with the various denominational groups in conjunction. First of all, it is evident that only the early Christian translations could have served as a possible source for the Muslim scholars of the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Islamic era, that is, the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era. Indeed, the parallels between some of the early Christian Bible translations and the biblical passages adduced by Ibn al-Layth, Ibn Rabban, and Ibn Qutayba are striking. Although their respective sources still need to be identified in detail, all three authors were clearly drawing on translation of Syriac Christian provenance. In some cases, the Muslim quotations even provide antiquems for non-Muslim translation traditions that otherwise cannot be dated accurately. This specifically applies to some of the historiographical works in which authors such as Ibn Qutayba and al-Yaqubi quote extensively from clearly defined groups of biblical books such as the Pentateuch or the Gospels. The situation is more complicated with respect to various lists of alleged biblical predictions of Muhammad's prophethood, which consist of quotations from a wide range of biblical books. As was mentioned before, none of the early attested translations comprise the entire Bible. Accordingly, comparison of biblical quotations in works by Muslim authors with the relevant translation traditions of non-Muslim provenance must be carried out separately for each book or group of books. Ibn Qutayba, for example, cites in his Signs of Prophecy the Pentateuch, Genesis and Deuteronomy, the Prophets, Habakkuk, Isaiah and Ezekiel, the Psalms and the New Testament, John and Matthew, groups of books that were originally translated and transmitted separately. His Pentateuchal passages, for example, can be identified as originating in one of the well-known Christian translation traditions, while the situation is less clear for the biblical passages culled from other books of the Bible. It is also noteworthy that, with respect to the Pentateuch, Ibn Qutayba draws in his Signs of Prophecy on a different translation tradition than he does in the above-mentioned historiographical work, the Book of Knowledge, another indication that Muslim scholars of this period were largely dependent on secondary sources. It can be taken for granted that Muslim authors gleaned the material directly or perhaps more often indirectly from a variety of sources when compiling the lists of biblical annunciations of Muhammad's prophethood. This is also confirmed by instances in which an author adduces the same scripture passage more than once, each time in a different rendering. In most cases, the author was clearly unaware that he was drawing on different translations of the very same biblical passage. The Shi'i Zaidi Imam al-Muwaffaq Billah, for example, quotes on 2 occasions in the course of his extensive list of biblical proof texts a largely identical passage from Psalm 149, each reflecting a different translation tradition. This presumably unintentional repetition, as well as the unsystematic placement of the first quotation of Psalm 149, indicates that the author had culled his material from different sources. Moreover, the common phenomenon of mixing biblical and pseudo-biblical passages in this type of list also suggests that Muslim authors consulted secondary sources rather than the original text of the Bible. Another indication that most, if not all, Muslim authors took their material from secondary sources, that is basically similar lists in the earlier Muslim literature, would be that the majority of authors adduced by and large the same characteristic biblical proof text. The most plausible scenario for explaining how these early Muslim authors accessed the relevant materials when compiling their lists of biblical annunciations is therefore a secondary or indirect reception. It was apparently at a very early stage that lists of biblical passages circulated that were understood to foretell Muhammad's designation as a messenger of God. Such lists were consulted both by converts as well as by scholars of Muslim origin, as suggested by the striking uniformity of such lists. Compiling lists of relevant scripture passages has a long tradition. It was a common practice among early Jewish exegetes who collected biblical passages emphasizing the election of Israel while omitting those underlying the universality of God's salvific will, and it was and still is a popular device among Christian authors identifying messianic passages from the Hebrew Bible that would predict the advent of Christ Jesus. The considerable overlap of passages of probative value adduced by Christians and Muslims suggests that the Christian practice was copied by Muslim authors who may even have used earlier Christian lists as their initial raw material. Similar observations can be made with respect to Muslim attempts to prove that the abrogation of the Hebrew Bible is a fact, a topos regularly invoked in their debates, real or literary, with Jewish interlocutors. Muslim authors may well have gleaned arguments and relevant biblical passages from parallel discussions among Christians, as is again suggested by the similarity of pertinent lists in the Christian and the Muslim literature. In addition, the theoretical possibility of abrogation on rational and or scriptural grounds was discussed among Jewish scholars such as Saadia Gaon in his book of Beliefs and Opinions, and by the 11th century Karaite scholars such as the aforementioned Yeshua ben Yehuda. The arguments of the proponents of the various views are echoed in the Muslim literature of the Middle Ages, which is an indication that Muslim scholars were very much aware of this intra-Jewish discussion and of the rational and scriptural arguments employed by the respective protagonists. Indeed, in dealing with Judaism, which in terms of theology is largely compatible with Islam, it was primarily the issue of the abrogation of Mosaic law that took center stage in the controversies. Muslim scholars sought to prove that cases of abrogation abound in the Hebrew Bible and that Mosaic law is therefore likewise subject to supersession. What the Jews pointed to Moses saying in Deuteronomy 4:2 when arguing for the eternal validity of Mosaic law, Muslim scholars countered by listing cases of abrogation in the Hebrew Bible so as to prove the permissibility of this principle in order to induce the Jews to accept the validity of God's most recent and final dispensation, the Quran, superseding Mosaic law. Over the centuries, as we have seen, Muslim literature dealt with the Bible, that is canonical and non-canonical books, as well as pseudo-biblical lore in Islamicized form, in a variety of ways. These trends, most of which can still be observed today, mirror the ambivalent attitudes towards the earlier revealed scriptures that was evident from the very beginning in both the Quran and the Hadith. There is a remarkable continuity as to the motifs and line of argumentation employed in these polemics over the centuries up until the contemporary period. This continuity is reflected first of all in the repertoire of biblical passages allegedly foretelling Muhammad's prophethood. As we saw earlier, most Muslim authors gleaned the relevant passages from the writings of their predecessors, and in many cases the lines of transmission of the respective lists can be exactly determined. The canon of biblical quotations that were adduced by Muslim authors therefore displays a remarkable degree of consistency over the centuries, and this is true until today. The number of Muslim polemical writings that have been published over the last decades, either in printed form or on the World Wide Web, testifies to the continuing popularity of this genre, and quoting the standard set of biblical passages remains a regular ingredient in these publications. Occasionally, we come across cases in which the established canon of biblical passages has been expanded. An interesting example concerns Genesis 49, 10 and 12, containing the famous Shiloh oracle. In the King James Version, these verses are rendered as follows: "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come. And unto him shall the gathering of the people be. His eyes shall be red with wine, and his teeth with milk." The passage belongs to Jacob's testament to his sons, with the verses in question being specifically addressed to Judah. According to Jewish understanding, they support the view that there will be always a ruler from among the descendants of Judah until the coming of the Messiah. This is also the context in which the Muslim polymath Abu Hana Biruni quotes Genesis 49:10 in his chronology of ancient nations. His contemporary, the Andalusi scholar Ibn Hazm, deals with the verse at length in his book of Decisions on Religions, Sects and Heresies when reporting on a discussion which he had with the Jew Ibn Narila. Ibn Hazm is primarily concerned with refuting the Jewish claim based on this verse that authority is now exercised by the head of the Jewish diaspora, the Exarch. The verse is also a common scriptural passage adduced by Christian authors, both in the Arabic-speaking world and in medieval Europe, against the Jews. It is also included in the debate between the Caliph al-Mahdi and the Patriarch Timothy I, which is assumed to have occurred in the final decades of the 8th century, where the latter uses the verse as an argument supporting the claim that after the coming of Jesus, prophethood would cease. The renowned 12th century Jewish convert to Islam, Samar al-Maghribi, also quotes Genesis 49:10 as a Christian argument compelling the Jews to accept the prophethood of Jesus in his polemical tract Silencing the Jews, while the 14th century Hanbalite author Suleiman bin Abdul Qawl al-Tufi in his Muslim Defenses to Uncover Christian Doubts, rejects the argumentation offered by his Christian interlocutors based on this passage. By contrast, Hassan bin Muḥammad al-Ghassas, the leading Zaydi theologian of Yemen during the second half of the 12th century, adduces the scriptural quotation as testimony to Muhammad's prophethood. As far as we know, he's the earliest Muslim scholar to refer to Genesis 49:10 and 12 as foretelling the prophet Muhammad, although it remains unclear which sources were available to him, though they were clearly secondary one rather than the Bible itself. In later centuries and until today, Genesis 49:10 and 12 belong to the standard repertoire of biblical passages testifying to the authenticity of Muhammad's prophecy. Another important trend that can be observed over the centuries is the way in which factors external to the Muslim tradition have a decisive impact on the ways in which the Bible was perceived by Muslim scholars. Pertinent intellectual discussions that took place in Jewish and Christian circles immediately influenced the Muslims' approach to the Bible. The impact of the intra-Jewish debate concerning the abrogation of biblical injunctions on the Muslim discussion of supersession in the Bible has already been mentioned. Another example concerns a series of polemical texts written by Ottoman scholars of the 16th and 17th centuries. Unlike earlier Muslim polemicists, the Ottoman authors drew on a variety of Jewish exegetical and theological works, alongside standard quotations from the Bible, including the Pentateuch commentaries by Sephardic authors such as Abraham ibn Ezra, one of the most esteemed authors among Jewish readers of 16th century Ottoman Empire, and Moses ben Nachman, also known as Nachmanides, works that belong to the literary canon of Sephardic Jews who fled the Ottoman Empire following the Reconquista of Spain, concluded in 1492, and the Alhambra decree of the same year. With the introduction of Hebrew printing in Istanbul in 1504, these works became easily available in the Ottoman capital in printed form, although it remains unclear in what manner Muslim authors were able to access them, since they were written in Hebrew. A further remarkable example concerns the Gospel of Barnabas, a pseudo-epigraphic gospel of uncertain origin that is usually dated around the year 1600. The text, which is extant in two manuscripts, an Italian manuscript dated to the turn of the 17th century with marginal glosses in Arabic, and a Spanish one from the 18th century, contains both the detailed account of Jesus' life and ascension that agrees with the Muslim rather than the canonical Christian perspective, as well as explicit references to the coming of Muhammad. Muslims became aware of the Gospel of Barnabas only towards the end of the 19th century. At the instigation of the Muslim reformer Muhammad Rashid Rida, who considered the Gospel of Barnabas to be closer to the original Gospel than the four canonical ones, an Arabic translation was published in Cairo in 1908. This publication propelled the Gospel of Barnabas to center stage in Muslim polemics against Christianity, which in turn prompted Christians to advance proof for its spuriousness. And the heated debate continues today, as a cursory glance at the World Wide Web shows. Yet another trend in Muslim polemics is the increasing reservation against the use of any material of Jewish or Christian provenance. This concerned first and foremost extra-canonical Jewish lore and traditions that originated with early Jewish converts to Islam and held prominence in Muslim literature during the first century of Islam. The increasingly ambiguous attitude of the Muslim tradition towards the extra-scriptural and heavily Islamicized material is evident in the classification of these traditions as Israeliyat, a distinctively negative term that is attested beginning in the 10th century and by the 14th century was in widespread usage, employed to marginalize and eventually to dismiss objectionable materials as Jewish and therefore problematic. Prominent representatives of this tendency during the Islamic Middle Ages were Ibn al-Jawzi in the 12th century and Ibn Taymiyyah and his student Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya in the 13th century. They vehemently argued for a systematic segregation between the Israeliyat and truly Muslim material. Over the following centuries, the Israeliyat were increasingly subject to expurgation, a trend that was further accelerated in view of the socio-political developments of the 19th and 20th centuries and continues up until the present day. One can safely speak of a systematic purging of the modern exegetical literature of any traces of Israeliyat. Moreover, throughout the 20th century, an increase in titles alluding to the conspiracy of Israeliyat and scientific ways to get rid of it can be observed in the Arab world, combined with an attempt to create a link between the early Jewish converts during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, the principal transmitters of Jewish lore and tradition, and modern Zionism. A landmark in this development was an article published in 1946 by Mahmoud Abu Raya, a favorite disciple of Rashid Rida, one of the most prominent influential scholars and jurists of the 20th century, who had also been instrumental, as we just saw earlier, in the publication of an Arabic translation of the Gospel of Barnabas. The title of Abu Raya's article reads, Ka'b al-Ahbar, the first Zionist, referring to Ka'b al-Ahbar, the 7th century Jewish convert and authority on Jewish traditions. Parallel to this trend, the Bible itself was increasingly excluded from the canon of authoritative sources, with a growing number of Muslim authors arguing for an outright prohibition on reading or citing from the biblical text. A similar tendency can be observed in the Muslim discussion of alteration of the earlier scriptures at the hands of Jews and Christians. It is obvious that the charge of alteration of the earlier scriptures conflicts with the claim that the Bible contains predictions of the Prophet Muhammad, a claim that presupposes the integrity of the biblical text. Nevertheless, both notions were regularly employed by Muslim authors polemicizing against Judaism and Christianity. To alleviate the evident contradiction, different views were formulated as to the form and extent of the alleged distortion. While some Muslim scholars maintained that Jews and Christians had deliberately distorted the biblical text beyond recovery, others held that it was rather the interpretation that needed rectification, while the text itself had remained untainted. Characteristically, the protagonists of the first view, that the historical text of the Bible is not authentic, point to the large number of translations of the Bible in a variety of languages, to the sometimes substantial difference between these translations, taking up the thorny problem of the multiplicity of scripture that indeed caused anxieties among the people of the book about the accuracy and stability of the biblical text, to the significant differences between stories that appear in the Bible and the Quran, with the Quranic version invariably serving as a benchmark against which to judge the distortion of the biblical text, the underlying assumption being that the Quran includes the contents of the original scriptures revealed to the earlier prophets, and to the substantial contradictions encountered throughout the Bible, such as variations in accounts of the same incident in Jesus' life in the various Gospels, a topos that again echoes the well-established Christian tradition of gospel harmonies, such as Tatian's lost but nonetheless renowned diatessaron of the late 2nd century. In addition, doctrinal statements of the New Testament incompatible with Islamic theological notions were also invariably classified as later interpolations, as is the case, for instance, with the notion of Christ being the Son of God, a claim that contradicts Muslim notions of God's unicity, and of Jesus as a messenger, one in a long line of messengers ending with Muhammad. Over the centuries, we encounter numerous literary attempts by Muslim authors to restore the authentic version of some of the books of the Bible, such as the Psalms of David or the Gospels, based again on the idea of the identity of contents of the Quran and the earlier revelations. Up until the 19th century, the two notions of forgery of the biblical text itself or its interpretation, were upheld side by side. By the mid-19th century, the more radical opinion that the biblical text itself was distorted eventually gained the upper hand. This was mainly the result of the enormous success of a book entitled The Demonstration of Truth by the Indian scholar Maulana Rahmatullah Kairanawi al-Hindi, a bestseller since it first appeared in Arabic in 1867 and which has since been translated into many languages, among them Urdu, Turkish, Gujarati, English, and French. The work was written in reply to The Balance of Truth, a polemical work by the German Protestant Christian missionary Karl Gottlieb Pfander, and it echoes the critical approach of 19th century European scholarship towards the text of the Bible. Al-Hindi was clearly aware of some of the pertinent discussions when writing the demonstration. The significance of Al-Hindi's work in the Muslim polemical discord against Christianity up to the present time can hardly be overestimated. Suffice it to mention here the impact it had on the popular South African polemicist of Indian descent, Ahmed Hossein Deodat, who wrote extensively against the integrity of the Bible. Seemingly in contrast to the trends just described, some kind of Muslim biblical scholarship emerged from the 12th century onwards. Again, only a fraction of the relevant material has until now been studied, with many texts still remaining unedited and undiscovered in countless manuscript collections around the world. This development partly resulted from an increased accessibility for Muslims to the Bible or books of the Bible through a proliferation of manuscript copies and from the early 16th century onwards printed editions. Muḥammad bin Zafar al-Makki al-Sikilli, who died in 1170, for example, discusses in detail in his The Best of Tidings concerning the best of mankind pre-Islamic predictions of the Prophet Muhammad, and he specifically devotes the first chapter of his work to the Bible. In contrast to earlier Muslim scholars, Ibn Zafar limits the discussion to a relatively small selection of passages. However, for each one of them he cites between 4 to 5 different translations, and he identifies those quite accurately and discusses them in detail. His systematic approach and his accurate identification of the respective translations that he cites suggests that he was able to consult the different Bible translations directly. Moreover, as an argument against the Bible and its followers, he consciously employs the multiplicity of scriptures for the Bible, which he contrasts sharply with the more or less established and unified text of the Quran. An additional concern for the Bible among Muslim authors resulted from the unprecedented flourishing of Copto-Arabic literature during the 13th and 14th century, the golden age of Coptic literature in Arabic, as it is known. Its corpus comprised numerous apologetic works by Coptic authors, which in turn spurred Muslims to compose counter-refutations against Christianity. The Egyptian scholar Salih ibn Hussein al-Ja'fari wrote a detailed analysis of all those biblical passages that testify to his view of the people of the book as tampering with their scriptures. The most impressive testimony of biblical scholarship of that period is certainly Najm ad-Din al-Tufi's critical commentary on the four Gospels, Pentateuch, and other books of the prophets, while his contemporary Ala ad-Din Ali ibn Muḥammad al-Baji wrote a polemical commentary on the Pentateuch, Kitab fi Naqd al-Tawrat al-Yunaniyya. In this work, the author discusses each book of the Pentateuch, often verse by verse, identifying the contradictions and other indications of alterations in the biblical text at the hand of the Jews. Both al-Baji and al-Tufi again identify precisely the Arabic Bible translation they were using. Another prominent case of a Muslim scholar who systematically draws on the Bible to interpret the biblical motifs contained in the Quran is the 15th century scholar active in Damascus and Cairo, Ibrahim bin Umar al-Bikai, with his exegetical work, Stringing of Pearls in the Correlation of Quranic Verses and Chapters. As did Muslims of the early centuries of Islam, al-Bikai acknowledges the integrity of the biblical text, which in his view can and should be used as a valid source of knowledge. Accordingly, he quotes extensively from nearly all parts of the Bible to elucidate the relevant Quranic allusions. Al-Bikai's extensive usage of the Bible triggered a fierce controversy among the scholarly elite of Cairo, while some supported the practice, others heavily criticized Al-Bikai for having done so. One of his adversaries, the renowned Qur'an scholar Muḥammad bin Abdurrahman al-Sakhawi, for example, composed The General Reason for the Prohibition against quoting from the Torah and the Gospel as an attack against Bikai. While Sakhawi's work has not come down to us, al-Bikai's defense, just words on the permissibility of quoting from the ancient books, is extant. Eventually, al-Bikai was defeated and publicly disgraced, and as a result forced to withdraw from the public life of Cairo. Be that as it may, his Quran exegesis continues to be widely read, as it is attested by the fact that there are currently available 2 printed editions of the multi-volume work. Let me conclude by adding to the highly ambivalent and partly contradictory picture some further remarks on the challenges contemporary scholars of the Bible in Arabic, such as myself, are facing. The majority of extant material still awaits scholarly explorations and is preserved until this day in manuscript only, manuscripts that are scattered in libraries around the world. Some are imminently threatened, such as those preserved in the numerous monastery libraries in Iraq and Syria, and others are accessible only with great difficulties, as is the case with some of the important collections in Russia containing material of Jewish provenance. While the inaccessibility of relevant manuscript materials is one problem, the boundaries between established academic disciplines such as Oriental Christian studies, Jewish studies, Samaritan studies, and Islamic studies, as well as biblical studies, also constitute, at times, severe impediments to scholarship. An obvious challenge thus results from the inherent interdisciplinarity of the field. It is only when the literary sources of all the relevant religious traditions are taken into consideration that meaningful results can be reached, and I hope I was able to demonstrate this in the course of my lecture. The countless translations, commentaries, and adaptations of the Bible that were produced by and circulated among Christians, Jews, and Muslims are intimately intertwined, and if we were to limit ourselves to the literary production of one religious community only, our results would be unsatisfactory. National funding policies proves also challenging at times, as I experienced as a result of my recent move to Princeton. The German Research Foundation, that is funding a collaborative 5-year research project entitled Biblia Arabica, the Bible in Arabic among Christians, Jews, and Muslims, no longer consider me eligible to co-direct the project together with my colleagues at Tel Aviv University, with whom I devised the project in the first place. There is another, in my view, far more challenging obstacle to scholarship on the Bible in Arabic. As a result of the ambivalent attitude of the Islamic tradition towards the two earlier monotheistic religions and their scriptures, and the stern aversion among many contemporary Muslims to seeing their own traditions as historically rooted in the wider religio-cultural environment of late antiquity, research relating to the Muslim reception of the Bible always runs the risk of provoking hostile reactions. As unacceptable as this may be from a scholarly point of view, the boundaries between Christian and at times Jewish polemical writings aiming at discrediting Islam on the one hand, and on the other scholarly investigations aimed at discovering Jewish and/or Christian elements in the Quran and the early Christian tradition, are fluid indeed, and this not only in the eyes of Muslim believers. None of this can or should prevent scholarly progress, of course, but it needs to be taken into consideration, particularly in view of the fact that interreligious polemics is thriving and has evidently lost none of its relevance or attractiveness. The only valid reply to any of these challenges is solid, robust, and collaborative scholarship and visibility well beyond the confines of academia. It is my pleasure, therefore, to end my lecture by thanking my international collaborators and colleagues with whom I have the pleasure to work on this important field of research, as well as the many supporters, funding agencies, publishers, and others. It is thanks to all of them that the Bible in Arabic is nowadays a field of research that is firmly established on the map of international scholarship. Thank you.